chit-chatting, I could introduce you to this Riesling, but...
Yeah, I have a feeling that you have like this expectation that I'm gonna like my head's gonna like blast off like I'm eating a warhead or something.
Kind of.
Really? Okay. Is this what you and Haley were kind of tasting earlier today? Is this one of the ones?
Yeah, we were working on our Riesling blend.
Okay.
Looking at because we have 3 different tanks of Riesling. They're all slightly different from each other. And I know that you like dry Riesling, so
right.
This is the really, really, really dry, really tart one.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so...
But we can start.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. Before I try this super dry Riesling that Melanie has foisted upon me, I have no idea what to expect. My name's Tyler Bradley. I'm the wine club manager here at Cinder, and this is Melanie Kraus, our founder and winemaker.
Welcome everybody.
Happy to have you all here. Somehow this is the first time Melanie have done one of these together. We've both done, it's been like every other one it seems like where you and I have been on camera.
Yeah,
and
we're like hosts. So we're doing it together, it'll be fun.
So we're going to try not to talk over each other because as hosts, you know, we're used to being in a certain seat. So today what we're going to do is we're going to recap the 2020 harvest, as last week we pressed our last red fruit. So harvest is winding down, it's over. Right now, we're in our new walk-up seating area. We have a few seats for small groups, winter walk-ups. We have nice twinkly lights, and surrounding us are all the barrels with the 2020 red wines going through secondary fermentation, malolactic fermentation right now. So today, I brought the expert on to tell us how the harvest went, and then we're also going to kind of drill down into what is harvest. We always say it's harvest time, it's crazy, but what does that actually mean? How does harvest happen? What are we looking for? So, Melanie, now is it 20 harvests you've done in your career?
Well, I think that was 19.
Okay. So, I am 28.
Well, long enough, I'm starting to lose track, basically.
Yeah, and Melanie is still young, but she's done so many harvests, so she can kind of give us a sense of, like, what's a normal harvest, what's a good harvest, like, why do people say that? So, we're going to talk about that today, and... First, though, I'm supposed to try this Riesling.
Yes, so it was a good harvest, and in celebration of that, I brought this tank sample for Tyler. You can see that it's still cloudy because even though it's finished fermenting, there's still a little bit of yeast in suspension in this. It's also got tons of carbon dioxide. That's another byproduct of the yeast, and the carbon dioxide makes it really tart, and there's absolutely no sugar left in this Riesling, in this particular tank. And so, I know that Tyler's a fan of really tart, really dry Riesling, so I brought him a really extreme example. Cheers to a good harvest.
Test. Cheers, thank you. Well, okay. It's not quite Warhead level, those little candies, but my mouth, I can barely talk right now. It's so tart, and it honestly doesn't taste like what I expect for Riesling. But with that said, this is going to be my mouth is going crazy right now. So this is one Riesling that will be part of your final blend. So you have 3 different tanks of Riesling right now.
Yeah, 3 different tanks. They all taste slightly different from each other. We have 1 tank that has a little bit of sugar left in it, and then 2 tanks that are completely dry. And so they will blend together to come up with that off-dry style. So
Gotcha.
A hint of sugar, but not really a sweet wine.
Cool.
And then lots and lots of acid to balance the sugar out. So that what we want with our Riesling is a really sweet, tart, kind of popping sensation in your mouth.
So kind of like when you're making a cocktail, you don't want all the tartness in the world. You want to balance it with something. Yeah. So that's what you're going to do with the Riesling.
Yeah, so Riesling is a really tart wine, and you balance it with just a little bit of sugar. You know, cool. The whole Mary Poppins thing. Teaspoon of sugar.
Well,
works well with Riesling.
Teaspoon of sugar would be good with this. I'm going to keep drinking it because I'm a masochist, apparently. So let me take a sip, and then we're going to start talking about harvest and what that actually entails. So, Melanie, before we begin, we kind of thought, okay, let's break down what harvest actually is, and we came up with a few kind of general categories for how grapes end up on the vine when we pick them and how eventually it becomes wine in a bottle. So to start out, I want to talk about yield, and you wanted to be clear that yield was the important term for this. So what is the importance of the yield in the vineyards, and can you kind of explain like what you're looking for and what the vineyards are kind of looking for?
Yeah, sure. So yield, tons per acre, is how we measure it in the wine industry. So we're talking about how much load of fruit can each vine ripen. And that's really critical, especially with red wines, because what we're going for with wine, of course, or particularly with red wine, is we're going for quality over quantity. So if you were growing corn, for example, it would be great. The bigger the yield, the better, right? But with wine, we intentionally lower the yield that the vines can produce in order to make a better wine. And so with red wines, for example, the vines can easily put on 10 tons per acre of fruit, but we would never want that because it'd be really watery. We probably wouldn't get ripe. There'd be a lot of problems if we just let grapevines go crazy on their own, because they're really vigorous plants. They want to reproduce. They'll do a lot of stuff on their own that wouldn't make good wine. So
that's why they climb walls, right? Like if you just let vines go.
Oh yeah, I mean a vine can climb 100-foot tree easy.
Right. Yeah.
So what we do instead is we control the yield. For example, red wines we would control down to about 4 tons per acre, is where most of my contracts are written for red grapes. And then for white grapes, we want a little more acidity. We don't need as much ripeness. So those we can have a little bit higher yield. So we're looking for about 5-ish tons per acre on most of our whites. And it was interesting this year, the yield was really, really nice. And that's kind of unusual. I mean, normally we're either dropping a whole lot of fruit because the natural yield was really high, and so the growers have to go through with the crews and they have to literally cut bunches of grapes off and let them drop on the ground to get down to that 4 or 5 ton per acre target. Or if we have a bad winter, something happens that kind of damages the grapes, then we may have too little yield, and in that case I'm usually trying to find uncontracted fruit to fill a little bit in around the cracks of whatever my normal contracts are.
Yeah, this is the first year I've worked here where you haven't been scrambling as much, basically. Like, usually if you're spot buying, it's like Melanie's on the phone, she's out in a vineyard, it's like, where is Melanie? She's trying to buy more fruit. So this year, it's kind of funny. I mean, I didn't notice anything too different for the year during the growing season, but you mentioned the winter and how that can drive what a vineyard produces. So the really important overarching thing for all of this is weather. And it sounds like there's a difference between the winter weather and actually in the growing season during the year. So in the winter, what can weather do? What are you hoping not to see, and what are you hoping to see?
Yeah, so winter really influences how much fruit is set on the vine, because what happens is you have the little, it's not a seed, but I can't think of another word for it. A fetus, that would be a better word. The fetus of the grape sounds kind of disgusting.
We all start somewhere. So
it's formed the summer before, right? So it has to survive all the way through the winter in order to produce fruit the next summer. And that means the weather in the winter needs to be fairly good. Now, that doesn't mean it can't get cold. Grapes are pretty tolerant to pretty low temperatures, but grapes don't like it to get really cold really fast. So if we have weather that goes like this really dramatically in the winter, that will tend to damage some of those little baby grapes that are they sit in the bud on the grapevine. So if we have really wacky winter weather or super deep colds or something like that, then you might have low yield the following year.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then summer weather generally doesn't affect yield that much, or at least not around here. That's in Idaho. We do sometimes have challenging winters, but usually we have amazing, fantastic summers. So
yeah, and so during the growing season then, which in the Snake River Valley, it's around mid-April to, depending on the grape, whenever we're ready to harvest, early September the earliest, sometimes mid to late October for some of the reds. So during that growing season, weather is a huge part of it, but if it's not affecting yield, what is weather doing? So in terms of sunlight and rain and any traumatic storms, like what are you hoping for? Like this year sounds like an ideal year for yield, but was it an ideal weather year as well?
Yeah, well, with the weather, of course, we need enough length and enough sunlight to get the grapes ripe, because like you were saying, harvest for grapes is way into the fall. Unlike, say, cherries, which harvest in June, so a really short growing season, grapes have a really long growing season. They need all the summer that they can get to get ripe. So, of course, we have to have warm summers, lots of sunlight. Fortunately, the Snake River Valley pretty much always has warm weather and sun.
Yeah.
So that's great. So this year, for example, we would say in terms of the growing degree days, which is just a unit that we use to say how many hours per day does the grape have where the conditions are making it grow. So temperatures warmer than 50 with sunlight, the grape's growing. So growing degree days this year were right on the 20-year average. So average growing degree days in the Snake River Valley means excellent wine.
Awesome.
That's basically what I'm super excited about this year, which sounds funny. Why would I be excited about average? But average in terms of our weather usually means great wine growing conditions.
Right. Well, that's awesome to hear. So 2020 wines, the whites and rosés will be released next year. The reds go until 2022, and that kind of goes into, okay, in the vineyard, the management of it.
Oh yeah, and well, I didn't quite answer your question. You were wondering about like how does weather affect the taste of the grape?
Right, because reds and whites are so different, right? So if you have the same year, how can it be average and good for both things?
Yeah, well,
how does that work?
Generally, seasons will kind of favor one style over another. And so depending on your personal taste in wine, you might like hotter years or you might like cooler years. So in really broad terms, warmer years are going to produce richer wines, whether that's reds or whites. In the reds, we'll really see warmer years. We'll feel it in the heaviness of the wine and the texture of the tannins. Everything will be bigger and richer in warm years. And the whites will be bigger and richer too. Of course, we try to control that because I want my whites to be essentially super aromatic and fairly delicate or very well balanced on the finish. I mean, we want them to be full flavored, but we don't want them to be too high in alcohol. We don't want them to be tannic. We want them to be graceful, smooth creatures on the finish. So if you have a warm year, it'll produce a little bit heavier bodied, both reds and whites. And if you have a cooler year, then the wine tends to retain its acid longer. You tend not to have quite as much alcohol in the wine. And for whites, awesome. I love a cooler year for whites. And then for reds, you're going to end up with a more elegant wine. It's going to maybe not be as broad in those tannins, but it'll be longer in its length. So if you don't like to eat your red wines with like a fork and steak knife,
right,
then you might like a year that tends a little towards cooler because it'll be a little bit lighter bodied or a little bit more elegant on the finish.
Right, and that plays into in the vineyard. So when these grapes start ripening, so I always think of the color change, which is called veraison, and that starts, what is it, like 6 weeks in general before you kind of want to pick?
Yeah, so usually we see it right towards the beginning of August.
Sure.
End of July, that time frame.
Right, so the whites and reds have different times where you pick them, but the ripeness is when, that's where like the acids start to drop a little bit, the sugars start to rise. And so since, Cinder, we don't own our own vineyards and you're contracting this fruit, how does the vineyard management work for you and in general with these contracts? So obviously they're working on it the whole growing season and the winter, but then when the rubber meets the road is when that color change and that sugar starts to rise, right? So how crazy is that for you, and what are you looking for from the people you contract fruit out in the vineyards when that really crucial time period starts?
Sure. Well, so when we're getting ready to pick, what I'm doing out in the vineyards is tasting the fruit, literally eating just tons and tons of grapes.
Yeah.
And I'm also checking the sugar levels so that I have an understanding of where the alcohol is going to end up, because more sugar means more alcohol. And so for reds and whites, I have different tactics. For whites, I really have a hard maximum on how much sugar I'll allow it to get. So I'm tasting it and I'm trying to sense as soon as the acid drops enough and as soon as the flavors start to get yummy, we're going to pick it so that we can get our whites to be lower in alcohol, higher in acid. These just make more graceful wines. And then for the reds, I take a totally different tactic. I eat the whole berry, including the skin and the seed and everything. I crunch it all up in my mouth, and I'm watching for maturity of the tannins. So the seeds, as they get further into the season, they'll get harder, crunchier. Essentially, they're hardening off for winter. They're going from an immature little green, very astringent, horrible thing to eat to a thing that resembles, more like a piece of popcorn or something where it's really crunchy.
Yeah.
And the tannins aren't so rough. So when I see that change with the red wines, provided everything else is going along well, like
Sure.
the sugar development and stuff, then the reds are ready to pick.
Totally. So, and this year, the other thing that's surprising about the harvest being average this year is, and this is related to one of the questions we have from the audience, is the condition of the atmosphere. So we had that smoke. We had huge fire season this year. And the fact that you ended up with a harvest you're incredibly happy about, even though we had, I don't know, how many weeks of smoke coverage was it here?
Yeah.
How does that affect the ripening of the fruit out in the vineyards if you have too much smoke over the atmosphere?
Yeah, good question, and one that tons of people have asked. So we had a couple weeks where there was pretty heavy smoke coverage here, mostly those big fires in Oregon and
California.
Washington and California.
Yeah.
The smoke was coming our direction. So first of all, it doesn't cause smoke taint, that sort of situation. Smoke taint happens when the fire is right on your vineyard, in it, next to it. Just it has to be very, very close.
Yeah, it's going to be like you or your neighbor, basically. Like on fire. Like.
Yeah. So I don't have any concern about smoke taint. Fortunately, I've never had to work with smoke taint in my career, but I have talked to friends who've had to deal with it, so I kind of know how close the fire has to be to cause that. But all the smoke in the atmosphere does make the UV bounce back out, and so we're not getting as much UV on the grapes, and ripening of the sugar is directly related to that. So even though it was very warm in those 2 weeks, they were the end of August, 1st of September, that time frame, even though it was very warm here, the grapes didn't ripen very much at all in those 2 weeks. It just sort of sat because they weren't getting enough UV.
Right.
So that did delay the harvest, I would say, by maybe 10 days from the trajectory that we were on before those big fires.
Gotcha.
But fortunately, we still had enough time left in the season that everything made it to maturity, got enough sugar, all that stuff. So we were still able to have a really great harvest afterwards. But it did make me bite my nails a little bit.
Yeah, it was a little nerve-wracking seeing, like, all of a sudden production crew doesn't have much to do because the fruit's not ripening. So that was weird at, like, the end of September. All of a sudden you're like, take a day off, I guess? You don't get days off at harvest. That's not how it works. So
Yeah, we took several off this year, which was
Right.
weird because
So-
we were just waiting.
So that also makes sense with UV being super important. So, like, you can have a high temperature, but if you don't get the actual rays, that's where the ripening comes in. And that's also relates to the vineyard management for canopy management, right? You want to cover from the sun. So this all makes sense the more I think
which you
about
can
it.
imagine, right? You can have a house plant, and yeah, your house is warm, but if your house plant isn't sitting in a
Right.
window, it's not going to do anything. You can't grow plants in a warm box with no sunlight.
Right.
So that's kind of what the smoke does, is it's like taking everything inside.
All right, so the sun's important. We've learned that again today. And I'm going to do a few more questions. This is great. We have a ton of audience questions. For people that weren't able to tune in right away, why is that Riesling and why are the whites cloudy right now? This is a question we get all the time for people if they've ever been back in one of our harvest tours. in the pre-COVID days. So why are the whites cloudy right now?
Well, this Riesling just finished fermenting maybe a week ago or something. So it's completely dry, but there's still a lot of yeast suspended in it. So the fuzziness that we're seeing, it's bodies of yeast. And so over the next month or so, those will just settle down to the bottom of the tank, and then we'll be able to pump the wine out, and it'll be much clearer.
Right.
And in the end, it'll go through a filter and completely remove any yeast bodies from the wine.
Okay. So it's yeast, our best friends. You got to keep the yeast happy to make good wine.
That's right.
So next question, do you ever blend different years to address differences between climatic effects?
That's a really good question.
That's a really good question, actually.
There are certain styles of wine that do that big time, like champagnes, sherries. But when we produce a wine that has a vintage on it, if we declare the vintage, which our habit is to declare every vintage, then we can only blend 5% of any other vintage into the wine. And so we will do that to some extent. That's just like, you top your barrels and you use a different vintage of barrels or something. It's not enough to make any significant difference in terms of changing the style.
Sure, yeah.
So basically, no is the easy question for that. In the style of wine we make.
Now, if there's like a lab or somewhere that's like, I would imagine like UC Davis, for example, like a place that has a huge wine program or a lab might do something like that. But yeah, champagne, that's a whole, if you want to be fascinated by blending different vintages, like go see how actual champagne's made, and it'll blow your mind that any of it actually tastes good, because they're tasting stuff that's like, then they're picking 10 years apart. Like, okay, this vintage was cool and this vintage was warm, let's put them together. You know, like you were talking about the cool and warm vintages. I mean, that's where the crazy stuff happens. Where for us, it's nice to know, like, every single wine we're producing is an expression of whatever the vintage was. That's kind of the fun part about wine, which is really nice. So,
yeah, it really shows the year. Although, one thing about growing wine in a desert climate like ours that's in a rain shadow is we generally do not have massive weather differences summer to summer. Whereas if you're on the coast in a climate that's heavily influenced by the ocean, that's where you're going to get like these years that are really good years or really bad years. Continental climates like ours tend to be much more steady. So the vintage to vintage differences that we taste are quite subtle.
Yeah, we're lucky here. You can count on our stuff being pretty solid each year, if not exquisite. So, okay, I think I have time for a couple more questions before we wrap it up. And one is progress on the wines you're cooking now. Cooking is in quotes. We don't actually cook the wines over a stove, anything like that. This is good because I was going to ask, what are you excited about this vintage? What's going on, and how are you feeling about the wines from 2020 so far?
Well, I'm feeling really good about them. I mean, we were hoping for a very smooth harvest because, of course, COVID is happening, and we didn't want, wild things going on with the grapes because that puts a lot of stress on the crew itself. Fortunately, things were very smooth, so I'm super thrilled with the wine quality, and we didn't go nuts buying new varieties or doing a bunch of spot buys, which is something I really enjoy doing, but I was keeping things kind of tight because of COVID this year, trying not to put too much strain on the actual crew and infrastructure. But we did have the opportunity to buy a little bit of Petit Verdot, which is a grape that we've never worked with here at Cinder, even though it's a grape I'm a fan of. So that's tasting good, and it's going to be very fun for us to be able to watch it, learn about it, see how it develops, and hopefully put it in the bottle by itself as a small lot series, and maybe a little bit into Valentina too.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's another Bordeaux grape, so you could add that to the Valentina. But I got to try it while it was fermenting. It was so good. So let's hope that we get to do 100% Petit Verdot this year. Okay, last question before I do a final few housekeeping things. Why do I hear about different clones? What does this mean in your wines? So we were talking about harvest this time, and we didn't touch on clones. Could you just give a brief summary on what a clone is? and I feel like I'm working back in Oregon again.
Yeah, let me take a drink here before I explain this.
Because this is very esoteric. It's important, but also, let's see what Melanie has for us on the clone subject.
Yeah, so the thing about grapes is that we propagate them through cutting, not through a seed. If we plant a seed from a grape, it'll produce something completely different from the parent. So instead we take a cutting, we get it to root, that becomes the new Cabernet Sauvignon or whatever. And so a lot of the European varieties that we use, they are hundreds if not thousands of years old, these varieties. And so people have been cutting them and propagating them for hundreds of years. And even though in theory the genetic material of the cutting is exactly the same as the parent,
That gives me the go ahead. Okay, no more technical difficulties. It's probably my fault. We got to wrap up. Melanie, thank you so much for your harvest expertise. And
No
it sounds
problem.
like we're in for an amazing batch of wines from 2020, which all of us can be stoked about, staff, customers, people that they don't even know about Cinder yet. Tell them that 2020 is going to be one of the best, most average harvests ever, and tell them average is what we're looking for. That's what we want. So something that's not average is what Melanie and I have in our glass right now is the Tinto Seco, our small lot series released in the spring just to wine club members. It's sold out in bottle. Thank you all for buying a lot of it. I bought a case myself. But we have some in keg. It's on tap. It's $40 to fill it in your flask. And come down. We don't have that much of it. So come down, fill your flask with some Tinto Seco. We also have these wonderful blankets. Melanie, if you could show the folks. It's getting cold outside, people, okay? And
Got the logo.
if you're chilly, we got the logo on it. Come down or go online, buy a blanket, send it to those folks who are always cold in your life. I have so many people I know that are like that.
I've already taken a nap under one here in the winery.
It's nap proof, okay?
That's
So
the good thing about being the boss is you get to nap on the job sometimes.
yeah, and we still have to work, which is fine. So she makes the wine, so we can't really say anything about that. Finally, any order, $100 or more, you get free shipping via FedEx Ground from today through December 16th. That's the cutoff so that we can get all the shipments out across the country in time for Christmas if you celebrate it, or any other holiday you want. Thanksgiving's coming up. Call us, go online, do whatever you need. We'll get those wines to you. And with that, we hope to see you all at Barrel Tasting on Thanksgiving or for a reservation in the tasting room. And we look forward to getting these 2020 wines in the bottle and in your glass next year and in 2022. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.